Hi, my name is Leonie Dumont, and today I will be just doing a brief, short presentation on the legislative process and how it works. So, in this presentation, I'm going to be discussing the different moving parts, how it works, and how we as American citizens can more so participate in this process and feel like we are a part of it. Because I think a lot of times when people don't know much about a subject or something, they tend to just opt out or not want to do anything or not participate. It's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. But I hope that in doing this presentation, it will give you a better understanding of the system, how it works, and it will encourage you to more so seek out um, more ways that you can be a part of this and how you can have a voice in your community. Without further ado, I will start my presentation. Bear with me while I learn how to use this, but I'm going to share my screen. And we will start the slideshow from the beginning. So like I said before, this presentation is for the sole purpose of, basically informing you about the legislative process. So let's start with defining legislation and what it is. So the word legislation is derived from the Latin word legis, which means law. Latum, which means to make or set. So the simplest definition for what legislation is just the making of law. So who makes these laws? We all know it's all carried out by the government, but do we really know who or what the government is? So, basically how government is described is it is a system of order for a nation, state, or another political unit. So some of the different types of government include a direct democracy, a representative democracy, socialism, communism, a monarchy, an oligarchy, and an autocracy. So just for the sake of time and for this video, we're just going to focus on democracy, which is basically what we follow here in the US. That is the system of government that we go by. So what is democracy? So democracy is a system of government in which state power is vested in the people or the general population of a state. According to the United Nations, how they would define or describe democracy, it basically provides an environment that respects human rights and fundamental freedoms and in which the freely expressed will of people is exercised. So basically, the people's voices are heard, and that's what creates democracy. So let's discuss democracy here in the US and why we are considered a democratic government. So the United States is a representative democracy, which means that our government officials are voted for and elected by citizens. So these officials represent the citizens' ideas and concerns in government as it relates to it. So there are different ways that we as citizens can participate in our democracy or feel like we are a part of it. So voting in an election is one way, or we can contact our local elected officials and just basically, provide our feedback, concerns. Those are kind of like the ways we can more so participate in democracy or in the whole legislative process. So everywhere has a beginning. So let's go back to the beginning. So the forefathers of this country, they, drafted up the Constitution. So the Constitution is, in essence, a living document, which means that however it applied 100 years ago, it is applied now to today, and it will apply 200 years from now and for future generations. So the Constitution and what is written in it is referred to as the supreme law of the United States. So since we are a constitution-based federal system, the power is distributed between national or the federal government and local or state governments. So basically, the Constitution created the federal government, but with limited powers. And that's why we have the three branches of government, which includes checks and balances on those powers to assure that no one branch of government supersedes the other. Later in the slideshow, I will go into the three branches of government, what they are, who are the key players in it. But like most things, we're all not always going to get along. It is not a perfect world. So there's always going to be conflicts, though, between the state and the federal. So, with that being said, there were other clauses, other additional, I guess, what you would call like doctrines that came from the Constitution, just to basically hone in on one specific detail, because a lot of times, as we can see with the state and the federal may not always agree. And we see the differences in different states, especially when it comes to gun laws. Some states it's open carry, and some states you cannot carry unless you have a license, and there's states where it stands your ground, and there's states where it's not stand your ground. So, with all of these conflicting laws, the doctrine of preemption had to be created. So the preemption doctrine refers to the idea that a higher authority of law will displace the law of a lower authority of law when the two authorities come into conflict. So basically, in essence, what this means is that if the state can't agree and the federal can't agree, we're going right back to the Constitution and we're seeing what it says. And from that, basically a decision or something will be made from it. But it all goes back and it all boils down to the Constitution and what the Constitution states. So another clause that came from the Constitution is the Supremacy Clause. So the Supremacy Clause states that the Constitution, federal laws, and treaties are the supreme law of the land, meaning if a state or local law conflicts with the federal law, the state or local law must give way unless the federal law itself is unconstitutional. In other words, it exceeds the power of the federal government. Once again, right back to the Constitution. And we also have another common clause, which is the necessary and proper clause. And how I like to refer to this clause is that, listen, Congress was created to kind of set rules, regulations, and all that stuff. But let's be honest, Congress can't be everywhere all at once. So Congress had to basically find agencies to kind of carry out their functions, because they can't be everywhere. So the necessary and proper clause has been interpreted by the Supreme Court to define what we called implied powers. So it is those which are necessary to carry out those powers stated in the Constitution. So basically, these different agencies carry out the functions of Congress. And later on, a lot of agencies came about, and we are all familiar with some of them. You have the U.S. Department of Education, you have the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, you have your local housing agencies, but there's so many agencies and they vary by state that came from this, all because Congress cannot oversee everything. So this is why this clause came to be. So let's discuss some other things stated in the Constitution. So it may seem that the Constitution grants broad powers to the federal government because of the three branches, but they are limited by the 10th Amendment, which states that the power is not delegated to the states by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. So in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, it also talks about limited powers that are set forth and are termed as enumerated powers. And basically, this set of powers granted to the federal government and specifically Congress. But then we also have concurrent powers, which are granted to the federal government and the states to use. So I will go further into that in the next slide. But for now, let's just take a quick pause and let's, look at the three branches of government. So we have the three branches, which is legislative, and they make the laws. Executive, they carry out the laws, and you have the judicial, and they're the ones who evaluate the laws. So let's talk a little bit about concurrent powers and enumerated powers that we had kind of briefly touched upon in the previous slide. So the concurrent powers, or like I like to call them, the powers that be, they can include, among other things, establishing courts, imposing taxes, and borrowing and spending funds. And these fundings are what is required for the upkeep of public buildings. So you have like your local courthouse, your civil, I can't remember the name, but basically it is all of the public buildings that those were what the funding is used for. Then you have the enumerated powers. Oh, what I meant to say for the concurrent powers was like City Hall and places like that. So like government buildings. So we have the enumerated powers. So this can include, among other things, the power to levy taxes, regulate commerce, establish a uniform law of naturalization, establish federal courts, which are subordinates to the Supreme Court, establish and maintain a military, and also declare war. So let's talk about the separation of powers that we spoke about before. So to ensure separation of powers, the U.S. federal government is made up of the three branches we discussed before. So we have the legislative, executive, and the judicial. And these branches of government were put in place to ensure that the government is effective and that the citizens' rights are protected, and that each branch has its own powers and responsibilities, which includes working with the other branches together, to form what we would call our government. So we start with the legislative branch. So they are the Congress, which consists of the House of Rep and the Senate, and they are all housed at the U.S. Capitol. Then we move on to the executive branch, which are housed in the White House, and that is your president and your vice president. Then finally, we have our judicial branch, which is basically the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court is the highest court, but then under them, you have the federal and you have the state courts. So let's go into a little bit more about the legislative branch. So the legislative branch is in charge of making laws, and it is made up of Congress and several government agencies. So Congress has two parts, like we discussed. They have the House of Rep and the Senate. So members of the House of Rep and the Senate are voted into office by American citizens in each state. So this is why it's important to vote in your local elections. So there are currently 100 senators. So that means that we have 50 states, 2 senators from each state to represent the people of that state. And we also have 435 representatives, 5 delegates, and 1 resident commissioner. So Congress enacts laws that influence the daily lives of all Americans and is intended to serve as the voice of the people. Its responsibilities include funding government functions and programs, holding hearings to inform the legislative process, and the oversight of the executive branch, which leads us right into the executive branch. So the executive branch of our government is in charge of making sure that the laws of the United States are obeyed. So the president of the United States is the head of the executive branch. The president gets help from the vice president and the department heads, who are called cabinet members, and heads of independent agencies. And our final branch of government is the judicial branch. So the U.S. Supreme Court is the highest court in the United States, and it is part of the judicial branch. So judicial branch, they are in charge of deciding the meaning of laws, how to apply them to real situations, and whether a law breaks the rules of the Constitution, which, as I stated before, is the highest law in our nation. So the Supreme Court is made up of 9 judges, and we call those judges justices. And they are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. The justices hear cases that have made their way up through the court system. So in essence, if someone is not content with how their case is handled from the local level, they can take it up to the state level. If they're not content with how the state handled it, they can take it all the way up to the Supreme Court. So let's discuss a little bit about legislation and the stages of a bill and how the process works. So we start off with the introduction. So basically the bill is introduced and it's introduced in the chamber. And basically once that bill is presented, it is given some kind of like name, but it usually starts with like HR or HJ, but there's some kind of connotation that goes along with it. And that is it while it's still in the bill stages. So the next stage is the committee stage. So basically, a representative sponsors a bill. The bill is then assigned to a committee who studies it. And then if that bill is released by the committee, it is put on a calendar to be voted on. Or amended or debated, but basically a discussion needs to take place. So basically, in order for the bill to pass, a majority must vote. So if it goes to say majority rules. So if we have 218 members of the 435 members in the House of Rep vote yes on it, then the bill moves on to the floor stage. So basically on the floor, this is the Senate now. So a senator usually also sponsors the bill, and they're the ones who speak on the bill and what it entails. So again, it will come up for debates, amendments, everything, and again, a final vote is taken. Again, a lot of votings here. Then we go down to the conference stage. So the conference stage is basically a conference committee, which is made up of the House and Senate members. And basically they work out any differences of the bill. And then it returns to the House and Senate for final approval. So once all of that is done, the last step in the process is the presidential signature. So basically, once the president receives this bill that everyone has agreed upon, beginning at midnight on the closing of the day, the president has 10 days, excluding Sundays, to basically sign or veto this bill. If he vetoes the bill, it goes right back and it's amended and the process can start again, or, they just do away with it. But if the president signs it, the bill now becomes a law. So that's pretty much how this flow chart, was defining it. I know it was a little bit like, what is going on, but that's how I basically defined it. So let's just do a quick recap of how this happens. So the bill is drafted, the bill is introduced, the bill goes to the committee, the subcommittee reviews the bill, the committee marks up the bill, then the whole chamber votes on the bill, then the bill gets referred to the other chamber, which is the Senate, and then the bill goes to the president. So if the bill passes one body of Congress, it goes to the other body to go through a similar process of research, discussion, changes, and work out any differences. So once both bodies vote to accept the bill, they must work out any differences between the two versions. Then both chambers, which is the Senate and the House of Rep, they both vote on the same version of the bill. Once a bill has passed in both the U.S. House of Rep and the U.S. Senate and has been approved by the president, the bill becomes a law and is enforced by the government. If the president vetoes, then it goes right back through the process again, and it can be represented again. It can be presented again. So how an idea becomes a law. So if you want to get your points to this floor of the Senate and the House of Rep, you can do it from a local level. So you can do it as a concerned citizen. So you may have concerns or issues that prompt legislations or laws to come into play. So as a citizen, like I said before, you can reach out to your local government official and present this, and the same way it's done in Washington, it is done similar within the state. So it goes through the bill draft, it goes through the second reading, third reading, conference committees, but it all starts with us as concerned citizens bringing up these concerns. So what does the legislation, who are the key components when it comes to legislation? It's you. So it's, we have to vote, we have to participate in our democracy, join our local political parties, visiting or writing to our local politicians. But as citizens, we do have, a say-so in the policy making and implementation of what goes on within our government. So 4 ways citizens can participate in government is: 1, they can speak on public issues. 2, by participating in community group actions. 3, by participating in political campaigns. And 4, by voting in elections. I cannot stress how important and how crucial this part is, but we need to vote. And, I would never say not to vote, for the presidential elections, but, the more important ones are at the local level. We have to vote for our local representatives because they're the ones who represent us. So they're the ones who are going to make sure that our voices and, our concerns are heard and, something is done about it. So I will conclude with saying this, and it is a quote by Abraham Lincoln: "Our government rests in public opinion. Whoever can change public opinion can change the government practically just so much." So basically, how I look at this is that we are the ones ultimately who can make this decision. We are the ones ultimately who can change, the government and how everything flows and works, because it all depends on how we speak up. So, as citizens of the United States, I urge you and I encourage you to really try to make an effort to just more so participate in government functions, because again, whether we want to believe these things will affect us or not, they do, because and do you really want somebody else making a decision for your life? So that's why it's important for us to really participate and be a part of this legislative process. And I hope that this short, small video kind of gave you a little bit more insight into how things work. And I hope that, it motivates you to get out there and to do what you need to do for your local and county governments. Once again, my name is Leonie Dumont. Thank you for joining me. Have a good day.